Not in on my laptop, so I'm
just waiting for this to go live, then I'll do it.
Notes have something going on.
Got it.
oh, yeah.
Okay, it all went quiet. I seem to be sitting like the headmaster. How are you guys doing? You nearly there? Just do your thing, clicker. We're in the lecture theatre. Those of you on YouTube, those hundreds of thousands of you watching Service Design TV, we're in the lecture theatre, coming to you live. And delighted to have Fran and Marc with their own emojis. So for those of you who are on YouTube live streaming, either in real time, and there's two of you, or one's just gone, oh well, then are watching the recording, which I wish we get often hundreds of people watching our recordings, which is great. Tell your friends. It's lovely to have these practitioner talks out there for the world to see, and I'm really always very grateful when people give us permission. So thank you, Fran. Fran is possibly my second favourite student. Obviously, Alessandro is my first. He's coming next week. Yeah. But he's very good. And it's lovely to have you back. And thank you, Marc. Lovely to meet you. And I'll get out of your way and let you start your lecture. Welcome to RCA.
Sorry. Screen. Oh. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Hello.
It's exciting to be here as a practitioner. Can you hear me from the back?
Yeah.
Perfect. So we don't need this because it was a bit too formal. So hi, I'm Fran, and is Marc.
I'm Marc. Nice to meet you.
Would you like to give us a bit of overview?
Oh yeah. So I'm with Fran. We come from EY7, and today we're gonna speak a bit about some of the research we were doing besides the work, more between practitioners, to share what we had in mind. And I think it will be related with your graduation project here and how it went further. And on my side, it was related with some of the research I was doing in my PhD as well, related on platform economy.
So a bit of agenda. So we're going to talk about what users are, or what we think they are, and then what they mean, what does it mean to be a user in our economic system, and then what change can, and different attitude we bring the prosumeristic one to what change can it bring. And then what it means for us service designers and for you in your career in general, but in particular as you have you are here at the RCA, which means that you have more freedom to like experiment if you wish with such a framework. And then it's going to be about a practical case. A lot is my and Asta Jory, also at the EY7 graduation project from 2 years back. And then open discussion if you want to ask any questions. If you don't want to, we save 20 minutes. And then the main messages. We are going to talk about being passive, being active, and different shades between consuming and producing. We are going to discover how all of this is a bit political, and then the key learning that we would like you to take away, that the users, according to me and Marc, have more than needs and pain points. They have an agency that we all. I believe we need to take in consideration from the scratch as we start a design project, a service design project in particular. So we wanted to make this a little bit interactive just for the first bit. Don't worry, I won't call you out too much. So can, by raise of hands in the room in particular, if somebody wants to put a comment in the chat, would be great as well. But yeah. Well, anyways, by raise of hands, please. Can you list one or two services that you commonly interact with?
Maps navigation.
Maps navigation. Something else.
Financial services.
Financial services, but be specific. Like, is it Google Maps or what is it?
Spotify.
Spotify.
Chat says public transport.
Public transport.
Like chat.
Deliveroo. Oh, amazing! I'm glad that somebody mentioned Deliveroo.
Banking and e-commerce on chat.
What do you
Oh,
think?
there you go. Thank you, Patricia.
Oh, banking, public transport, e-commerce, restaurants, Uber. Yes, all good. And what do you think is the best definition of users for these services? It's don't be too pressured, like we accept any, because there isn't one specifically. Anyone? Chat not even. Well, I don't have an answer for that. I mean, at least I didn't prepare it. So we wanted just to tell you, in particular for who mentioned Deliveroo, it's a great conversation starter for what we want to say, that usually users are considered ends of services that have to be served, as the word services imply, rather than be considered active part of it. Their passivity is monetized by service providers. That is actually the exchange. I serve you with a service and you pay me, which makes us consumers in our economy. But this is just one way of being. It's just one way of considering users in the economy, and in particular as service designers. We report a framework from the New Citizenship Project, and specifically from the New Citizenship Report. And as you can see, consumers is in the middle of being a subject and being a citizen, and they have to be served and choose amongst the other. They choose and demand from the system they live in. What the New Citizenship Project urges is a shift away from this mindset of considering users consumers, and they suggest, as their name says, a citizenship towards a different way to participate in the economy, in society, which needs facilitation. So that means I like to think that it needs us as a service designer. And so this young lady here is Margaret Thatcher, and this is about when I'm not an expert in this, by the way. It's just like my own thoughts, so don't call me out. She brought at the state level the concepts of freeing people from the state and make them independent. If you remember the slide before, consumers were independent and they were to be served rather than themselves be subject of the state. So her thinking, that again was the first time that was at the state level, at least in this country, was suggested a shift from being subjects to be consumers. And what I wanted to say here, and this was at the beginning very positive, seeing this very positive, and we still see the positive aspects of essentially what is theorized as neoliberalism, because we have more freedom. It was about being freed and let people become entrepreneurs of themselves, which is all great. The very reason why I came to the UK, because we are in liberal countries, right? There is a freedom of movement and all of that. So yeah, but that comes up with there is a flip of the coin, and the flip of the coin is high individualism and competition and overconsumption. So now, with in the present in particular, we see at a societal level this this flip, this other side of the coin. So as the New Citizenship Project suggests, and as we want to say today, is that we need to shift from consumers to citizens or to prosumers, which we consider as in-between concept. And Marc is going to tell you more about that. And the problem with being a consumers only is that extreme individualism creates a rift in society between us as people and between people and the environment, the city where we live in. So that's why it's considered, we want to address it in our own practice. So to sum up, consumers are self-interested and choose what is best for them, whereas citizens help shaping. You want to put a co-design word, co-design instead of help shaping. The choices that are available to them and are mindful of the consequences of their actions. Again, to reiterate why this may be a problem is that this is an extreme case. In a study published on Elsevier, 40% of a sample of kids between 4 and 7 years old in the US believed that hot dogs come from plants, which is pretty astonishing. And it's about that rift, you know. It's not only necessarily like being competitive, it's just you don't know what is behind, in this case, the supply chain. You think that hot dogs you pick up, moms pick it up from the supermarket, so they must come from plants. And this is this mindlessness we want to address. Like we think that involving and getting people to participate in the design process and in the service, not just serving them, but facilitate them to interact with the society is what we really want you guys to pick up, if you like, because now, as said, we see that overconsumption is a big problem, and like we need to shift away from it, we believe. And yeah, exactly. So we suggest that there is no need to like go away from consumers and become citizens. So I acknowledge our interdependence with the whole system that provides us with services, products, and ultimately life. So I'll pass it on to Marc.
Thank you, Fran. Can you hear me as well at the back? So how does it affect us as service designer, or what does it mean for us? Here, what we wanted to share was some thoughts that we discovered while studying about the topic. So it's like sharing and opening the discussion with you. And especially when we look at the prosumers, when we discuss about it, we discuss about an audience. Like how do we, as service designers, how do we define our audiences, and why does it matter? This is center. And prosumers come, of course, from producers and consumer. And actually, these terms were coined in the particular time related with the political economy discourse, and basically trying to put into place a particular system to produce wealth. And the consumer was the other end of the producer on one side, and we need the consumer on the other side, as Adam Smith was writing. This is the sole end in order to make the system work. It's very basic, and this is how we usually interpret producer and consumer still today in the major parts. What it means behind is that it also means behind these terms that there is one side, one role that is more active, that is producing wealth, and the other side which is considered more passive. And if I do a bit of a caricature, for instance, when we look at the archetypal consumer, like a housewife, the labor that she might be doing is often never considered as work or as producing wealth or producing value. And it comes from the fact that it was initially coined as this end of the economical system. But the consumer, the term itself, evolved, and it's now part of the everyday language in many different languages. Even like in Japanese, there is some particular term, like consumer, etc. And we see that in the 50s and 70s, at the time of Margaret Thatcher here in the UK, but Reagan in the US and other elsewhere, there was a need to keep on producing consumer, creating needs, and through advertisements and through the communication agency, in order to keep on fueling the economy. But on the other side, we also see that the consumer themselves were organizing themselves in a consumer association in order to defend their rights. So suddenly there were like more active than only passive. They had some agency by themselves. They had some willingness to do things. And this led to some of the discussion around the term of prosumer in the 80s, which was a way to reconcile the consumer aspect and the producer aspect, to acknowledge the creativity of consumers. And this was to a moment when we get out of the industrial society into what we have today, more post-industrial society with some blur boundaries between work and leisure, between home and office and everything. So initially, in the terms from Toffler, sorry, the prosumer was kind of a positive way to look at it and to acknowledge the creativity and how consumers are participating to produce wealth in the system. But at the same time, we were also at the time of this neoliberalism moment that were also coming into effect in a larger scale, where all of us, we start to consider ourselves as a capital, that we have to take care of our own capital. So we are our own entrepreneur of ourselves, as Fran was saying. So it puts also a burden on us. This is us who have to perform and to deliver things, which leads to another aspect of the prosumer sides that was coined by Ritter, as for instance, the McDonaldization of workers. So the self-service, for instance, when we speak about self-service at McDonald's or in the bank, it's also a way to use the passive consumer and to make them active to take care of part of the system or part of the service in a way. So there are these two ends to it. And more recent research on this topic, we're trying to show that there is a gradation between this level of activities. On one end, you can have the DIY prosumer doing baking at home, gardening, and all these kind of activities, but also like the self-service prosumers who is put at work in some part of the service. And as service designer, we use their agency here. Also, in terms of customization, when you take some hacking or ways to express yourself, express your individuality, and add value by customizing. To the prosumers who are also part of some collaborative, for instance, like Wikipedia, producing content that can be used by many others. Those who are doing it for monetized purpose, like for instance, Airbnb or Etsy, to those who are almost like tiny producer by themselves, like home that are producing electricity to sustain themselves or to go back to the grid, or professional YouTuber, for instance. So here we have the other ends where we have someone who is amateur who have become kind of a producer, professional producer. So there is a gradation between both. And what it means when we were discussing with Fran about it, is that often as a service designer, we look at our audience and we define them with persona, for instance, as one way, where we look at what are the user needs, what are the jobs to be done, what are the pain points that they are going through. And when we think of prosumers, when we look at their contribution, it just helps to maybe enrich the persona, enrich how do we define our audience, to acknowledge both their creativity that they can bring in, and both the fact that we shouldn't maybe put them at work on behalf of someone else. So some of the aspects on which we can build, for instance, are what kind of labor we can add or ask for our users, what kind of physical capital or intellectual capital we can build upon in order to build the service with them, with their capacity, and engage them within the service. And so the last note here is that there is a gradation in the potential of user contribution, and it can be both on one side, the empowering the user, as we usually tend to be willing or trying to do as service designers, but at the same time, bearing in mind that we can also sometimes end up putting people at work, maybe not them willing fully having that. So we always have to bear in mind, like, what is the right position we want to have and how do we want to contribute to the right activity. And with this, I give it back to Fran for his graduation projects that have some new development.
Thank you, Marc. And yeah, so we wanted just to make this a little bit less theoretical, and so that's why I'm gonna present like my and Asta's graduation project. I hope that you didn't see it online already, because if not, it's gonna be boring from now on. And then this just because like we wanted to like see and show you how. I can't go back if not I would. and show you how like baking in your approach and in your mindset, this framework that we have just introduced can lead to different outcomes that I personally like, and I hope you do too. So we saw, and a lot is about urban space and interaction with the urban space. So we were researching the landscape of how people interacted with green spaces in the UK, and we saw that there was a loss of access despite high demand. Like 900 people were in the waiting list for 200 plots in Camden only, and this was counterbalanced by citizen initiatives. In Camden, they wanted to plant 2,025 trees in a citizen-led way, so bottom-up by 2025. And there are no profits. London National Park City is like a charity that is looking at making London wilder, healthier, and greener. So there was a lot of like bubbles at the surface. There was a lot of interest. And as we did our desk research and as we went on field research, we discovered that there were three main layers of stakeholders: the local citizens that we are focusing on, and the local initiatives and councils, pretty much in terms of land owning, because they were owning the land that the local citizen wanted to like access. And I would like you to focus on the left-hand side here, and these were the motivations that people were in, because these were the motivation at the basis of the people's interaction in the green space. Somebody wanted to release stress, somebody wanted to like find for new friends, others wanted to grow their own food, or finally someone was worried about the city's biodiversity. So we very much considered it how we could empower these people that were highly motivated and make sure that the system would cater for this. That was something that it was their purpose ultimately. So a user story that we found out is Claire. And she finds a plot of land unused and neglected. You see the soil there, so bare and used, and she can't understand who manages it. She decided, despite her not being able to get hold of the council and get official permissions, she starts growing anyway, and she's soon joined by other people. So there is a little movement in a very small part of London. But unfortunately, somebody complained, and since she wasn't able to like get official permission, the council just decided to strip it back to bare land. So what's the main insight here? There are many that we found, but the main insight is that the management of council's land doesn't take in consideration the citizen proactivity, and the UK it's there, and it's evident that it's there despite the high interest for it, as we said. So we wanted to design something different. And I hope that if press center, this is the video of our proposition. And yeah, I think that's how I start. Sorry.
Did you share sound?
She said that I couldn't share sound. Yes, I share sound.
The dance. Oops.
What is a land management and implementing specialist that needs to be?
Back in the real world now, aren't we?
Yeah.
is land management and co-maintenance platforms, decentralized management, and use of green infrastructure at neighborhood level.
Let's see how it works.
Claire is a 30-year-old working woman, a Londoner by birth. As her concerns for climate change increased, she got into gardening to improve the biodiversity of her neighbourhood. One day, during a walk, she notices a new sign in an unkept area of the local park. Curious to know more, she gets closer. Intrigued by the invitation, she decides to scan the QR code. Lot is a public platform that partners with the council, enabling citizens to claim bits of urban spaces. On reaching home, she logs onto Lot's website. She finds that via Adopt a Lot, she can claim that patch she saw earlier as a steward. Citizens can also assist in setting up new projects as co-stewards or volunteer in established ones via Lot to Do. Lot to Say, a community forum, allows citizens to comment on projects around them. She clicks Adopt a Lot and decides to filter the patches according to their location rather than size, owner, or type of stewardship. She inputs her postcode. And there it is. The uncut lot appears on the map among others. Claire hits the icon eagerly. She likes that it is a 2 square metre patch where she can grow vegetables on a year-long minimum lease, and up to 2 other people can join her. On clicking on the claim button, she is asked to register and provide a proof of address as an identity check. Next, she starts to look at the project plan. She types in the description of her ideas for the patch and sketches for the area. After a few days, she is notified about her verification and acceptance of the plan by the landlord. A digital contract is sent to be signed by Claire. She also finds a terms and conditions form that states accountability for the site, the length of the lease, renewal conditions, and other legalities. Lot sends Claire a stewardship certificate and a board to hang on the site. She is finally good to go and gets growing. Brian is an expat student from Australia. He can't.
I'll skip the second part. And yeah, so this was to be like an example of like how we can enable users to do what they really start to do and not just serve them, or like to how innovate current systems in a way that they can cater for differently for users. These are more examples, both for France. Ceschi Le Patron is a food brand that where the user is a co-creator. Ceschi Le Patron surveys their consumers and asks them for what requirements and what criteria they should mind, the brand should mind as they select from producers. And Le Ruche Qui Dit Oui, that in the UK is named, is called the Food Assembly. And it's a way, it works as a middleman in between producers, local producers, and consumers. And in particular, what I found really interesting, a consumer who buys ultimately the food is gonna pick it up and then set up in the neighborhood a stall with all the online orders from the neighborhood. So they take the order online, they go out, and then they go back in the city to let the other consumers to pick up what they have ordered online. And can you think of anything that after all this explanation, that any service that you know that now considers their users as prosumers, now that we have given the explanation? Social media is a good one, because I consume the content that you produce. Who are prosumers? No? Cool. So yeah, again, the main message here was like there are, we have a social responsibility as designer. We shape society as we design, and if the bigger the company you may get after the course, and the bigger is the impact that you're gonna have. So this is all very political, as we said. So yeah, let's, as Marc was saying, let's make sure that we make the most of this concept and no, we don't distort it. Thank you.
Questions? I got loads of questions, so get in before me.
I can ask a question. First of all, love the presentation, blown away. I loved your final project. I think that's incredible.
I was just thinking that oftentimes the ability to create something, it's a luxury, and oftentimes marginalized communities don't have the space and time to actually invest in doing something, even though they may want to, like when you have to put food on the table, when you have kids to pay, single parent household, these things complicate it. What's your advice for enabling and doing this process kind of I totally forgot the term, sorry.
Prosumerism. Yeah.
How we could enable marginalized communities to take part and to create sort of things that the barrier of entry maybe isn't as high and takes into account that certain people have certain abilities to give more time and give more effort.
Thank you for the question. And mainly in the experience as we try to bring forward a lot, it is finding what those barriers are and address those barriers. For example, on the side, I was doing some research in Lambeth with marginalized communities, and the main insight we got, it was about air pollution, and the main insight we got that people don't get involved in that specific case because there was no representation of other ethnicities in the council. So maybe it's more of a systemic exercise, because like addressing inclusivity with one project, addressing inequality with one project, it may be too difficult because it's a societal thing. But yeah, it is about bringing up and calling out what are the barriers and come up with proposals and finding the root causes for them, and possibly, I hope you manage, I couldn't, coming up with solutions that address them.
I think so on this question, the first step already like to identify and to make it visible what people can, what those population can do, cannot do, are we looking for. It's already part of the finding a solution in the end. So the ability to visualize as designers, to visualize and to communicate and to make other people part of the conversation is one of the initial steps as well.
With consumerism as well, there's a lot that is dependent on the evolution of demand and supply that caused a big change in consumerism. And now with prosumerism, you get it. With that, and it happening in smaller pockets in more local communities and more creating communities within themselves, what do you see as a macro level impact of that in the coming years as it expands, like especially with the demand and supply? Because what you're creating here is interaction based versus industry to industry or industry to consumer. So what do you see as a macro level impact of prosumerism in the future?
It's a great question, thanks. I think it's hard to answer precisely, but there are some effects. For instance, if you take La Ruche-Qui-Dit-Oui, the food assembly, or if you take Airbnb as another example, it's redefined the whole distribution channel that was owned by particular industries, and then suddenly it becomes a bit disrupted and owned differently. I think one of the other long effect is these smaller communities, like identified and active communities. Before brands or companies were speaking about brand community, it becomes more into not how to own this community as a brand, but rather how to identify and work with them to enable them to keep on producing and making them having a seat within the company. For instance, I know some French companies who were having the R&D departments and some prosumers who were becoming part of the R&D. So it questions the question of employee and not employee, but working on the same aspect. So some might be some of the long-term trends that we can see.
And hopefully, like address that rift that we were talking at the beginning. Like, for example, one thing that I noticed, I geeked out on food system after this, and I noticed that I was at the time 24 and I didn't see a plant of broccoli in my whole life. Like, so it's about that reconnection in between how things are produced and possibly local communities. And then I forgot another point, but yeah, I'll keep it later. Yeah,
thanks a lot for the presentation. I think Lord Todd's project that we looked at was really good. One of the questions was that like previously in the past, like how a lot of industrialization started was small guilds and pockets making things, and then it got centralized because of economies of scale. And in a lot of commodities that we look at, specifically in food, things are grown in batches and in large quantities because it achieves a lot of economies of scale and things become cheapable. But when you talk about prosumerism, when it's distributed again, how do you see that scaling as an economic system, considering what we're used to and the kind of environment we live in?
Cool. Thank you for the question. Very interesting. Now I understand why people say interesting question. It went a bit beyond like my personal research, but I guess that it is, well, I don't know, Marc, do you want to go to that?
I think it's a brilliant point you are making. Like what we see emerging today looks like what was happening before. Somehow before the industrial time, when people were organizing at a smaller scale and owning their own production and delivery aspect. But what we see today is that the people who are engaging into it do not have the knowledge or the know-how or the space or the time, like for instance you were saying before, do not have the time actually to do it. So it's not exactly the same thing as before. It looks like, but it's not exactly the same technically. And it requires some facilitation or some enablers, getting some barriers out. When you want to discuss with your neighbors to do something with them, it's not that easy actually when you think about it today. So there is a lot of things that need to be added back somehow to facilitate it. And the question of scale comes when on one end of these prosumerism systems, like the Wikipedia, for instance, Airbnb or the Uber, here you have the scale of platforms, which looks only at the transaction aspects. How do you facilitate this transaction between you and your neighbor, or you and someone you don't know, in order to make something happen? And here you can enable systems that can enable to scale up the number of transactions. One person keep maybe having like 10 transactions a year or 100 transactions a year, do not become like an industrialist, but the overall scale can be scaled up that way. And for the other parts of the activities, when we think about like DIY or others, here the reproductivity or the scaling is not really interesting because it remains more authentic when it remains small scale. So it's not always interesting to scale up or to make a lot of profit out of it in a way. So it's nice to find what is the balance, where is the value for the end user. If that answers your question.
So in a sense, can we assume that prosumerism would work if a product is not commoditized? Like if it's special in some ways, it's Airbnb special because each house is special, or DIY special because it's made for certain, yeah.
On my perspective, the commoditization is part of the process. For instance, Airbnb, what you commoditize is time and space, and you have to organize it to make it happen. And the economic transaction you have with someone, actually, it enables people who do not know each other to agree on something and to meet. For other platforms like Couchsurfing, where there is no transaction happening, similarly, way less people engage because they are kind of wondering, like, why should I engage with someone I don't know yet? It's kind of a bit scary. Suddenly, when you put a commoditization moment in between this transaction, it enables people to feel like, oh, I'm a consumer, I know how it's going to be. It's kind of easy, you know who will be, what role each one will have. And beyond that, there is some other connection that happen beyond. But the commoditization can be interesting trigger to make it happen as well.
I have two questions. My first question is, so you said that handle prosumerism with care, right? So what are some situations where you think it's more important to have passive consumers, or where do you think like that dominancy is kind of more important? Like for example, I've noticed in a lot of projects that we've done so far in the last 2 years, people talk about like knowledge sharing systems because there are so many services. I mean, there's so many gaps in these systems, even in local government, where you need that kind of sharing of knowledge to happen, knowledge as a resource. But then people are so time and resource constrained to invest their time into something. And very often I find that our thinking as service designers doesn't really go beyond creating a platform or a marketplace to bring like to create this group of prosumers and consumers. So how do you really address that? That's my first question. And my second question is, how do you design for prosumers who might misbehave in the system?
Well, I guess in about this second question in particular, what Mark was saying before is like that moment where Airbnb enables you to trust the other host. It's like it's with some sort of verification. In our project, it was about like submitting a a bill as a proof of address to demonstrate that you actually live in a certain neighborhood. So one worry of the councils was that people misbehaved. So us as designer, we need to like mind that and find ways to create that trust because it's a trust issue. And I guess that it depends on project by project. And that would be my answer to that.
So just a follow-up question. How do you make it more bottom-up than top-down? Like instead of enforcing more rules around this, are there ways we can make that that approach more bottom-up where we kind of subliminally get people to act more, I guess, community friendly?
Yeah. I think it's a great question because it questions the position of the designer, of the service designer. Like, what do we do? What do we do not do? Like, not doing something is already an action as well. Like, preventing ourselves from doing something is an action. I don't have the precise answer, I would say, but like, for instance, if I think of some systems or some situations like healthcare, when you have the patient as well, who is asked to be kind of passive, but at the same time, like proactively doing something for his or her health. Or maybe like working with the public transport places where, as passengers can also be proactively providing services to their fellow passengers. But somehow the public transport company would rather have the passengers passive, not to interfere with what the agents would do. So they would rather find ways to make people remain as passive as possible. So it's easier to transport actually when you're passive. So there are cases where actually there is, at a system level, it seems to be more efficient to keep people more following the rules in a way. Which links to your second question as well, like how do we deal with the creativity of people to abide by the rules or go beyond? I think here it would be, I guess, project by project, like how do we, by discussing and listening to the participants, what would be the right kind of governance body? It's not maybe not a nice word, it's like too complex, but like what is the right place of discussion to make sure that this element can be discussed and agreed and debated by the participants themselves, and not by someone outside that says like, okay, here we have seen this is a fraud, let's change the system to prevent the fraud. But like having a place where the discussion can happen, and when as a designer you can hear that and propose solution afterwards, but it's not you who is already pre-imposing what is the problem kind of.
I don't have my thoughts structured, but thank you so much. Thank you so much for presenting. And you mentioned that consumerism is like you have to find that balance between giving them back something or just getting your job done. And I was thinking in terms of two things. So one is, let's take the example of Lot, which is definitely like an amazing example, and it's giving back that knowledge and making people aware. Versus, let's take the example of like Amazon Fresh. It has definitely like cut back some operations in the channel that has to be done, but it has to put in so many more like technology in order to make that place cashless. So I think where I'm getting back to with this is, even if you have good intentions with your consumerism project, like how do you measure it? Because it's really difficult to measure and show it back to, let's say in the example of Slot, like show it back to the council that people are actually learning. Because in order to make, and going back to Amazon Fresh, in order to make some of these happen, you have to put in so much of technology, even with Lot. which costs money. So how do you show that back and how do you measure it? Because these are definitely difficult things to measure.
Well, I guess that is, I assume that is not relying on technology. Possibly the answer is about I guess that the prosumerism is about taking things slower. Like, I don't think that what we are proposing here, for most parts, in particular for something a lot, is about speeding up. It's actually about slowing down, because it's about sharing responsibilities, sharing knowledge, and getting together. And of course, getting together requires time. I'm skipping your question. In terms of assessing, I think that, as you say, it's very difficult, but I assume that if we slow down, it is that problem not phased away, but we can assess people the results with more time at our availability. So I guess that will require less technology. And well, I guess that the prosumerism, if it's not misused, it's not about making a lot of profit. That's a point that most probably we have to make. If it is about self-service, you can earn on the labor of people, but it is not, from my perspective, why I care about this, it is about making people mindful of what's around them, and but it's not something that you can go to an investor and say, hey, I have the idea of the century, prosumerism. No, it's not about that.
Thank you.
I don't want to take a lot of time from the students, but it just seems like besides trying to design trust, you're trying to design empathy between communities that are not tight-knit. So have you ever thought of conducting some ethnological research in very small communities that are not tarnished by any urban developments, and see the relationships between the producer and the consumer in such small communities? Because in that case, both parties have something to learn from each other. So there is a certain trust and a certain empathy between each other, because they know where they are, why things are like that in their communities, and what they can achieve through the hardships they're going. And I just cannot see how that will ever be able to be scaled, because it's something that's on a human level, one-to-one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is our next step. Like
Our laptop is shut
well, I mean, it's a thank you with our faces on, so I guess right. Yes, you're right, completely. I think that what we can follow, it is a framework. It is not like a recipe for success. We are going to do some ethnographical research. That's why this is not necessarily a packaged solution. There is a lot of work to do because of all these questions that it's pretty difficult to address. Time constraints, brain constraints, time, money constraints, a lot of constraints. But yeah, you're right. That is definitely something needed, and what could come out of that is like guidance. Of course, a service can't tell the two of us how to relate with one another, but it can be facilitated.
I think so. It's a great question, and somehow I remember like doing some research for the PhD I was doing, where actually in the neighborhoods there is some mistrust actually at first. In neighborhood or smaller villages, because people know each other, they know what they did and what they have done before. They would not make any. They would rather not engage with each other actually. So somehow in some of the villages, I remember like having the opportunity to connect with people located elsewhere, but who share the same interests, was actually a relief and a way for these people to find the support and the access to the network they needed to go further on their projects, because locally they were constrained. So it was the opposite was true as well, surprisingly.
You can still keep going if you're happy to.
Thanks so much, Fran and Marc. So my question is around the target audience. So when I think about prosumerism. And to me, is more of you are trying to empower, engage people. And when it comes to the audience, I would probably divide it into two groups. One is those people who are already interested and they might already be active in the group, and you are just more giving them a platform to do it. So that's kind of targeted. But the other group is who may not be involved right now. They don't even know they might be interested. So it's a bit of an unknown group. So my question is, when it comes to that group, how do you identify them? And then do you identify them so that you can design a service that's targeted to engage them, or you just keep it open and hoping whoever's going to get engaged, they'll get involved?
Yeah. I guess that from a design perspective, let me think about it. So engaging people that are not proactive enough. Yes, as MVP, in this case, we were considering just the people that are already proactive. And then we have as a working assumption that later on, or as the movement grows, more people are going to get interested. But as this, you remember there were signs in the proposal that was mostly to raise awareness, and it's about finding ways to raise awareness, and not imagining that everybody wants to be involved. Like in council estates, this was based on council estates, there are a lot of opinions about how to use green space, and it's not something that you or we're gonna solve tomorrow. It's about making sure that because people are proactive, to not shut that door. It's about trying to cater for that and not like impose a way of working that maybe is not satisfying. And in this specific case, came from a willingness to cater for some, in this specific one, sustainability objectives that the council had, but they didn't have systems to make that happen at a local level. So it's a discussion. And actually, I wanted to ask, all these questions are amazing. I haven't questioned my own thinking for a while. If you wanted to be in touch, please, Karen, can you share my email?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Should we, any more? I've got a question. Well, not a question, a statement. First of all, thank you, Fran and Marc, for a brilliant talk again. Thank you. I hadn't really considered this before, so you've really enlightened me. But there was a really interesting piece of research done in Cornwall a few years ago, which made me think that some of the answers to your questions is about where there are services missing. So, for example, in Cornwall, it snowed. It doesn't snow very often in Cornwall. The council didn't know what to do, so the local council estate residents shoveled their own snow and kind of organised themselves. And it was like, oh, wow, we did that. That was interesting. And then the other thing they did, which was famously described as the cheapest piece of service design in the world, I'd love your thoughts on this, was that because public transport is very bad in rural areas, somebody spent 45p, I think it was, on a spray can, and they sprayed a circle next to the bus stop. And only people in the village knew that if you were waiting for the bus and it wasn't coming, if you stood in that circle, passing by people who would go, the locals who were going to the town would know that you're a local, you know about the circle, and stop and pick you up and take you to town.
That's amazing.
That's a bit of prosumerism, isn't it?
Yeah.
It hadn't occurred to me before, but it was a lovely little story, that. And the other thing I was just going to mention is we've been talking to University of Chicago about ABCD, which is asset-based community development. And I think that there's a whole list of stuff there. If you just Google asset-based community development, I think there's something you might find interesting. And we've actually signed a memo of understanding with them to try and start working with them. So it feels like that's going in the same way. And when we have conversations with University of Chicago, we get so excited. We say, this is the future of everything. But then Patricia made a good point. So it could be the future, but it's early days. But I think it's really interesting for service design. And the reason Chicago are interested in this is that it's this idea that we're white knights coming in to solve everything, you know, whether it's third world aid, whether it's service design, and actually we need to have a different model. And I think you've lit a fire here today, Marc and Fran. So thanks for amazing lecture. You get another round of applause. Why not? Thank you, and thanks everybody online. I'll stop the YouTube now, and we'll see you all very soon, I hope. I'm gonna stop recording as well. Thank you.